Okay.
Thank you for coming. So, am I in camera range? Okay, great. Fine. So this week we started with I saw actually that when you sent it out, you put a nice disclaimer. I just want to remind everyone, this is not homework. So you looked a little nervous that I was loading it on a bit much. This is not homework. You don't have to do it. If you choose to listen in advance, so I think it will enhance the experience, and I think you'll enjoy it. So I tried to be, especially afterwards, when I gave you a lot about last week's session. So, of course, use what you want, what you're interested in, follow up, and these are resources, but obviously don't feel compelled or obligated to follow up at all. Just, it's there for any of you who find it helpful. So this week, for the first time, we did actually the podcast that is right now my favorite, which is More Perfect. More Perfect is from one of the Radiolab guys, this guy Jad. So he started a spin-off about the Supreme Court, which has really been excellent. This Dred Scott one, the one that we listened to, is a little bit unusual for the series. Usually what it has done is gone through a case in the Supreme Court, often very prominent cases, and then gone and given the story behind the case. And some of them are really just outstanding. I mean, it happens to be an area that I'm interested in anyway, but just the storytelling is remarkable, and I highly recommend that you fish around if you're looking for things to listen to. I think that's really a great place to start, and if anyone's interested in just one or two samples to get them going, what are particularly good ones, I can tell you which ones I like a lot, or maybe we'll do another one over the next week or two. I'm deciding between two different topics for this coming week.
Send them both and make one optional, so.
Yeah, okay, so again, that's why I'm trying to be over-inclusive and let you guys, everyone can do their own borer, right? You can choose for yourselves what you want to partake in. This Dred Scott one, they call it, they call it American Pendulum 2. The week before they had done one, the name of the case escapes me now, but they did an update. American Pendulum, what they did was basically the two most notorious Supreme Court decisions in American history. So Dred Scott was one of them, and the one before, I'm forgetting the name, it's a very, very famous case, was about the Japanese internment camps. And they told the story of the guy who was the plaintiff, and it also was very well done. This Dred Scott reunion story was unusual in the sense that it wasn't really that much about the case, but just this thing that I guess it's a very American type of, and it seemed pretty 21st century, this idea of getting all of the interested parties, 100 plus years later, almost 200 years later, getting everyone together. It almost seemed like a different podcast. It was less about the Supreme Court and more just the story of this remarkable happening and how it went. So what struck me listening to the Dred Scott podcast, again, for those of you who listened, and I'm curious to hear your feedback as well. What struck me was this whole notion of me apologizing for something that I had absolutely no control over, because my great ancestors, whatever it was, did something wrong, or me being the beneficiary of that apology, not beneficiary, but recipient of that apology, because of the damage that was done to my ancestor. And honestly, this is something that is bigger within our society than just this one interaction. The whole notion, and this, they haven't done their episode, but I assume it's coming, on all the affirmative action decisions in the Supreme Court. That very notion of affirmative action, the Supreme Court that allows affirmative action, even though that seems to fly directly in the face of the Equal Protection Clause, right? In other words, the Equal Protection Clause says that we should not be making classifications based on anything. Race gets what the Supreme Court calls strict scrutiny, which means that you're almost never going to be able, depending on what kind of classification you're making, it'll either get rational basis scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny, right? Rational basis scrutiny just means it's a totally non-harmful distinction. So if I wanted to decide that if Carvel decided one day we're going to have a sale and people wearing red shirts get 50% off, so if someone with a yellow shirt would come and sue, so then they wouldn't, all they need to do is defend it with a rational basis. Rational basis scrutiny almost always, with few exceptions, almost always means that you're going to be okay. You just have to present, this is why we did it, and this is why we did it in this particular way. Fine. Intermediate scrutiny means somewhere in, well, strict scrutiny means you're almost never going to pass, right? Race gets strict scrutiny. And what you have to show is, it was important that we divide based on this, based on race, and this is the least intrusive way that we could have gotten to the result that we wanted. That will almost never pass. Intermediate scrutiny is something like I don't know if I can say gender anymore, or sex, whatever it is. In other words, if you would subject gender to, and maybe this is where we're heading, if you would subject it to strict scrutiny, so then you couldn't have men's bathrooms and women's bathrooms, right? In other words, you couldn't have bathrooms segregated based on race. That doesn't fly. That will not pass an equal protection form. But what they're saying is, no, gender and race are different. There could be good reasons to separate based on gender, for locker rooms, for bathroom, whatever it is, as opposed to race. That's what we call intermediate scrutiny. I don't know if it's the only one, but it's, if there's another, maybe there are two. Strict scrutiny almost always fails. Affirmative action is an area where it does pass. And the reason that it passed, there are a couple of reasons. One of them, they say, is that diversity is in itself a goal, that is this supreme goal that's very important to reach. The other one is that paying up for past imbalances, so we kind of, those two, there's a big nafkamina between those two reasons, right? Practically, if it was just the second reason of making up for past misdeeds and disadvantages to certain racial groups and advantages for certain racial groups, that would see, and that's where the conservative line of the court is a lot more comfortable, because that has an expiration date, and at least theoretically, that has an expiration date. Once we pay back whatever it is, what in theory that could end. Diversity as a goal in itself means that affirmative action is forever. I don't know, I'm not sure what the Torah angle on that would be, but what I think the Torah angle that's relevant to us, to me, is this idea of us either paying a price or reaping the benefit of the actions that we didn't do at all, that our parents and ancestors did. So that's what I was listening for in the Dred Scott podcast. I think those were really very poignant moments. The apology, the responses to the apology, I found very interesting. Any thoughts or reactions on your part? Okay, so let's dive into the sources a little bit, okay? So, sorry?
No, was the apology really, was it a real apology, a
I
sincere
think it
apology?
was. I think it sounded that way to me, although they heard it differently.
They heard it differently, that's.
Some of them, right.
But they said also, no, with the apology, you know, how you feeling and how you're saying it.
How you saying it?
Right.
And wasn't he a big official in somebody's administration, one of the Toomey ancestors? Didn't they mention
One of the
that?
descendants?
Yeah,
I
one
don't
of the
remember.
current
Is it
ones, governor or something, Toomey?
Pat Toomey?
The,
Oh, this guy works for Toomey?
no, Toomey worked for one of our either presidents or governors.
Toomey is a descendant, is that what they said? I didn't remember that.
Not Toomey,
Tammy.
the slave owner,
Oh.
This one who apologized was somebody in
Was it-
politics,
was an
current
official?
politics.
Okay, I
So
didn't
that
remember
was
that.
kind of
Good.
a sore point that he
Interesting.
rose.
Yeah.
I was only gonna
Both
add
should be.
that even when an apology followed by action is meant to make up for mistakes of the past, even that is tricky, because with the affirmative action that you mentioned, there are always members of the Black community who feel that it implies that the only way they're gonna get ahead is if they get special treatment, and it also embarrasses them that every Black student that comes in is assumed to be there not on their own merit. So even then, it's very tricky.
And
to-
interestingly, that is, Justice Thomas talks a lot about that's why he doesn't like affirmative, one of the reasons why he doesn't like affirmative action. He'd rather have the level playing field and allow people to, and allow people to sink or swim on their own, but then those who swim are, everyone knows that they belong. I mean, obviously, Justice Thomas has his own very complicated relationship with these issues, because it's hard to know whether or not, I mean, there are certain times when, I mean, I remember when Bill Clinton was appointing an attorney general, so he appointed one woman, and then she didn't make it through, there was some issues, one of them had a nanny issue, one of them had I don't remember what it was, he appointed three consecutive women. At the time, there were already women in government, but not a gazillion, so is it possible that just the three top candidates for attorney general were all women? It's certainly possible, but it looked like almost a Romney-esque binders full of women, you know, like I'm checking this box over here. Would Thomas have been appointed to the court by I think it was by the first George Bush, if he weren't Black? So certainly the people who don't like him say no, right? In other words, he's the case that really puts people almost a little bit arguing against their normal case, and yet he's the one who everybody assumes that he got his job because of affirmative action. He is a very outspoken critic of affirmative action. If you don't like him, that's hypocrisy. If you do like him, that's, you know, he's the one who really feels the brunt of the disadvantage when we go out of our way to advantage people. I think either way, it's something that, in general, our country is very race conscious, and it's not going away so fast. I don't know if the Supreme Court
So,
has.
but my
yeah.
point is not, that's
Please,
very
please.
interesting. My point is not about race necessarily, but to try to go back to the idea of apologies from the past, and restitution. Is restitution possible when it wasn't at the time, but later, to say that it's very complicated later, and it can't actually make up for.
Undo for the damage,
For the
sure,
damage.
for sure. I remember Charles Krauthammer, I think I'm remembering it correctly, he works for the Washington Post. I think he grew up Orthodox, the Young Israel of Long Beach has a donation sign that from, I think it's his parents, whatever it is, smart guy. So he once wrote an article saying, you know, we spend on this, we spend on that, you know what the best use of our money would be? Let's take X number, and he divided it, let's just end this race division once and for all, write out a check for anyone who Native Americans, African Americans. Yes, we have a checkered history. We didn't do great. What's the right number to allow us to go forward and put race behind us? So the answer might be infinity. There's no such thing. In general, with damages, we don't say that, right? In general, when X harms Y, they sue in court, and no matter what they did, so we say, well, we want to help victims, so we put a dollar amount on it because the alternative is, okay, so there's a wrongful death suit, right? So what's the value of a human life? It's infinite, but that's not a helpful number. So we try to put dollar values on these things. So he made the case. That is, I don't think it was taken up seriously by real policy people. Yeah.
To take from a different sphere, but I was thinking of German reparations.
100%.
That's
100%. It's really the same. It's really the same
yeah,
question.
the same.
And to what extent do we expect modern day Germans to be constantly apologetic and they didn't do anything, right? So I think it's very much the same question. So let's do a little bit of Torah sources on this. In general, vicarious liability is not viewed as a Jewish ideal, right? That's very Christian. We don't usually assume that someone suffers for our sins. And yet, there seem to be some conflicting evidence. So, for example, if you just look in Parsha Kitetse, so just a parak apart from each other, you have source Bet, which says, Lo yumsu avos al banim, ubanim lo yumsu al avos, if bechato yumas. Right? Yumasu. Parents don't die for their children's crimes. Children don't die for their parents' crimes. Everyone dies for their own crime. And yet, we see both in thought and practically in law. So you have later, if you look at Nehan Vav, we see Poked Avon Avot Al Banim Val Bnei Banim Al Shileshim Val Ribeim, that Hashem holds a grudge, right, for 2, 3, 4 generations. You see it again in source Vav and Zayin. I don't know why they ended up together. That we do see this idea. So different people approach this differently. They say maybe that one is legal, right? That we don't execute, we don't punish as a Beit Din. We don't punish people for crimes that they didn't commit. And whereas the other one is just God in his kind of cheshbon, where often, I'm mixing up two answers here, but what they say is sometimes that is like an element of mercy. I'm trying to think where this comes up in the one that the muscle that I can think of might not be that helpful, but in sports very often they have teams have salary caps, how much they're allowed to spend. So there are certain rules that if you structure a contract in a certain way, you don't have to take the whole hit on day one, X amount of dollars. You can spread it out over a number of years, because if you gave a signing bonus for $100 million, so then that would wreck your salary cap for the year. You can spread it out over the life of the contract, and therefore take a small hit each year instead of one massive hit right away. So some commentaries say that what Hashem is doing by saying that he holds a grudge for 2, 3, 4 generations, that is actually an element of mercy. Sometimes we commit these horrible sins, whatever it is that we do, and Hashem is saying, I will spread the damage out. If God were to punish us immediately what we deserve, that would be devastating. He says, I'll spread it out, right? Okay, so there are ways to jive this. What I found interesting is that right after that pasuk of parents don't die for their children's crimes, children don't die for their parents' crimes, we have the parsha of Amalek, right? And Amalek, it says, we have, again, so Amalek comes with its own peckle of, what to talk about and moral issues by itself that is not that we're not going to talk about that. We're definitely going to leave. We're not answering Amalek today or anytime soon, but just this small piece of it. Amalek is deserving of being wiped out. Why? Asher karcha baderech bezanev lechubecha kohanech asher lim acharecha v'atayef v'yager v'lo yirei Elokim. When we left Egypt, so they attacked us. Not only did they attack us, but they attacked us in this cowardly way of, attacking us from behind where the stragglers and the weakest were. And we were ayef v'yager, we were fatigued, and they didn't fear God. So why are we attacking the modern day Amaleki for the crimes committed thousands of years ago? Now, practically, of course, Amalek is not active law these days. Right? Sancheiriv already many years ago mixed up all the nations, and therefore we don't assume that there is any national integrity from before till after. Therefore, we don't know who's who, and it is not practical law at all. I'm not sure whether it's how much they mean it letter of the law, or if it's more homiletic. People say that Amalek is this, it's almost like Paro is not a common name. Paro is just whoever is king of Egypt. So they say Amalek is not Amalek with a capital Ayin. Amalek is whoever is the evil nation of its time, and that can change from generation to generation. In which case it's not genetic, and that solves a lot of our moral problems, right? And then what it just is don't turn the other cheek, eradicate evil. If that's what it means, according to the people who say that, so then that is a pretty good way of getting at it. But why are the modern day, to me it rings very true about Dred Scott, why are we holding modern day people accountable, at least in theory, for the crimes committed by their ancestors? And it's not just Amalek. If you look over here in Devarim, Lo Yovo Mamzer B'Kahal Hashem, right? Another very troubling mitzvah. And it seems very difficult. A mamzer is someone who's born from a severely forbidden sexual relationship, either adultery or incest. So that person is not allowed to marry. It has a very limited pool of people. It's not that they're not allowed to marry, but they have a very, very limited pool of whom they're allowed to marry halachically.
What if
Yeah.
that person converted or was adopted and started over?
So adoption wouldn't necessarily change your status, but conversion would. In other words, there's no rule of mamzer for non-Jews. So a person who is born out of a severely forbidden relationship but isn't Jewish is not classified as a mamzer, and then they convert and they're just Jewish.
And if they're adopted and given a whatever conversion?
So then you're a Jewish person. There's no
Birth study,
mamzer.
mix of whatever.
Yeah. So then then they're a convert. Then they're Jewish. So mamzer, it seems incredibly painful and unfair, and why is the child paying for the crime of the parent? And it doesn't go away, mamzer, right? In other words, a mamzer's child, even if the moms are married, who they're permitted to marry, their child is a mamzer. It never goes away. Lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi b'Kahal Hashem. Someone from Ammon, someone from Moab, is not allowed. Later, at the time of Ruth, they interpreted this to mean just the men from Ammon and Moab, right? But the pasuk says anyone, or just the men, as we interpret it la halacha, they're not allowed to marry forever, right? Gam dor asiri doesn't mean just 10 generations; it means forever. Why? Al dvar asher lo kidmu atchem ba'alechem u'b'mayim b'derech teichem miMitzrayim. Two reasons. V'asher sachar alecha ad bilam ben ba'ar. And so both reasons don't necessarily apply to both nations. There's conversation about which is Ammon, which is Moab, which is both. But the two reasons are that number two, that they hired Bilam to curse us, and the other one, the first one, is that when we were passing through, they didn't offer us provisions, food, water, whatever it is. That's particularly offensive I think most people explain it this way, particularly offensive because Ammon and Moab are the children of Lot, right? So Lot, who received so much from Avram and was taught this particular midah of how do you treat, especially how do you treat family, and for them to go and turn their backs on us was particularly offensive. But the Ammoni who somebody meets on a college campus and they hit it off, who wants to convert, so again, Sancheiriv mixed us up. It's not act of law. We don't know who Ammoni and Moavi and Mitzri, right, for the first 3 generations, in theory. None of these are active laws, but why are they paying the price? Because their ancestors didn't give us food and water back then. So how do we understand this idea of paying for the crimes of our parents, grandparents, etc.? It doesn't bother us as much, but it seems almost equally unfair in the other direction, right? Anyone who is a Kohen, so why do they have the privileges of Kohuna? Because Aaron deserved, because he was happy for his brother, whatever it is, Aaron deserved this reward, and therefore, when it's time to eat truma, when the next Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, or get the first Aliyah, or so Kohanim have these advantages that the rest of us don't have. Why are we all Jewish? Why do we have the privileges of Judaism? Because Hashem loved Abraham. So what does that have to do with me? What did I do? Because our parents said, Na'aseh v'nishma. I didn't do anything, right? I'm reaping the benefits, and we highlight this every day. We call in our protectia. It's like I'm applying to Harvard. They would have no interest in me, but my mother went to Harvard and her father went to Harvard, and so is this the legacy? So what's going on over here? How do we understand it, both for the part that works for us and the part that doesn't work for us, for the negative, which we find more offensive, and even for the positive, where it doesn't rub us as much the wrong way, because it's not like anyone is paying such a price for it, but it also seems, it really is, I think, the same question. So if anyone has thoughts or insights, or I don't feel that bad, because the Madoff piece, really, I don't have that much more to say beyond what was in the article. So if we don't get there that much, and you just got to listen to what I thought was a very, very interesting podcast, talking to the man who nobody talks to, and if you read Professor Zeman's article, so I think that's all cool. If we get a chance, we'll talk about it a little bit. But okay. So I think there are a couple. We're not going to solve this problem. I don't claim. I think these are big questions that I don't claim to have answers to. But I 2 points that make it easier for me to live with. So number one, in terms of, is it fair? I'm not sure that that's always the question. But I think what might be going on here, let's give an example. If, God forbid, let's say there's a woman who's pregnant, and throughout her pregnancy, instead of taking whatever vitamins and going for her regular checkups, so she spends those months drinking and abusing drugs, etc. And then the child is born with whatever problems come as a direct result of that. So the child is very much handicapped through no fault of its own, based on the poor decisions of the mom. Or if a child is conceived through a relationship that wasn't done in the smartest way, and therefore is HIV positive. So is this kid, I'm not saying it's the mom's fault, or the point seems to be that our actions have consequences that go beyond ourselves. And that's not and therefore you're being punished for your parents' crimes. I'm not being punished for my parents' crimes. I am, and this happens to all of us, right? We all are who we are based on decisions that our parents made in terms of nature, in terms of nurture. My parents may have thought that my elementary school was a great school, and then they started, and then they started pinching my cheeks and whatever. Okay, so maybe they did make a good decision. Whatever it is, we all are who we are based on the decisions that our parents make for us, and they put us in certain situations. The big difference is that there's a natural world where we can see cocaine leads to, low birth rate leads to brain damage, where we can measure that scientifically. And then there's this metaphysical world where we don't see it as much and it doesn't feel as real to us. But if the notion of mamzeret or amalek or any of these examples, if we take the metaphysical world seriously, so it's not that mamzeret is a punishment for the child, it's that this is the metaphysical reality of the halachic system. And the Torah says don't do this. And if we do it, so then there are consequences. I know the punishment consequences distinction is one that I think many of us struggle with as kids. It makes a little bit more sense as we get a little older. But the consequence of that action, of that mistake, so there are going to be lots of consequences. It's going to be devastating for the people's marriage. A couple commits adultery. So it's going to be devastating to their marriage, to the spouse of probably each of them, right? Are they responsible? Is it fair that the husband who didn't do anything wrong, now his wife committed adultery, and that marriage is now forced to be dissolved? No, but when we commit actions, often the consequences go beyond ourselves. If we take the metaphysical world seriously, so then halacha says that this goes on not just to my child, but to other generations as well.
But doesn't at some point, like bechira, come into that? Like if I make that choice, and I have bechira to do that, why should that really affect how it's gonna, something that happened 20 years ago?
I think,
something
look,
like that?
so I think there is probably an element of punishment, and there's certainly a deterrent element in the people. Realize that if you commit this bad act, so the consequences won't just affect you, they will affect the people around you. I almost think of it almost like driving drunk, right? So we have all these campaigns where don't drive drunk, because you're gonna do major damage to yourself and to other people. But God forbid, after all the campaigns, somebody doesn't listen and they make a terrible decision. So usually it's not just going to be a one-car accident. They're not just going to do damage to themselves. And it will be horrific and tragically unfair to the other people who they affect. The real victim, the families of the victim. You have all of these concentric circles of damage that you're doing because of your bad action. Yeah, one person's bechira can affect all different types of people. Yeah. I'll tell you, my wife is often my sounding board on these issues. I didn't tell her that we were talking about this today. She hates when I give this talk. The second part of what I'm going to say, she hates even more. So let's...
I'm just asking about using the word bechira.
Yeah.
Because when somebody is committing adultery or driving drunk, there is no conscious decision there. The person
No.
doesn't have the ability to say, I shouldn't get into this car, because sometimes they're so far gone that they don't know what they're doing. Or
So
drinking.
both so American law deals with that in terms of mens rea is how you can't be held accountable unless you have a certain degree of consciousness that you're doing. Right? If someone sleepwalks and they do something when they're sleepwalking, so you can't hold them accountable. Halacha has something very, very similar. I think most legal systems will. And I think what they say is, okay, so it becomes drunkenness is not gonna take you out of responsibility, because as most of us do, don't put yourself in a responsible, if you're going to voluntarily put yourself in a position where you're losing control, so take the appropriate safeguards to make sure. And you said adultery also. Why wouldn't there be bechira by adultery?
Because people get caught up in the moment, I guess, and just
Okay,
don't
and
know.
that's, but is that not bechira? I'm not sure that's not bechira. That actually is what we were gonna talk about by the series that you did not choose, that I think I'm gonna try and do for the students later about Torah lessons from Hamilton. I think that's right. So maybe if anyone wants to come back, we can talk about one of the songs is How to Say No to This, when Hamilton really ruins his life by committing adultery. So I think the Torah has a recipe for that also. So I think yichud, that's right, because no one else was in the room. I don't know if there's any Hamilton fans over here, but he really does give you all the answers within his own play. He was in Washington Heights. Maybe he overheard cheer from YU. He knew all these things. I'm sorry. Who would you? Yeah.
So, when we talk about the metaphysical consequences,
Yeah.
so if there are metaphysical consequences, does that not suggest that we're limiting the bechira, the responsibility of the subsequent generation? In other words, when in the physical sense, he didn't have a choice about being, impaired in some way. But if you talk about moral impairment, that restricts your relationship possibilities, entry into the Jewish, whatever it is, that flies in the face of our notion of individual responsibility.
So I'm not sure. I think our path to Olam Haba, our path to being a good person, is going to be determined by everyone. It's going to be determined by the choices that we make, thumbs up or thumbs down, and all of us, who we are, is an accumulation, is to a certain extent the product or sum of those choices. What challenges I'm going to face on my way towards being the best person I can be, well, that's going to be determined based on tons of things that are outside of my control. Am I Jewish or am I not Jewish? We can both make it to Olam Haba. We're going to have very different challenges, right? I have 613 mitzvot, so they have 7. We can both maximize our potential. Am I male or female? Am I a Kohen? Am I a Levi? Am I Yisrael? Do I live in Israel? Do I live outside? Well, I guess I can control whether I live in Israel. But tons of generations were not able to control whether they lived in Israel or outside of Israel. What kind of parental upbringing did I have? What kind of schooling did I get? So, being a good person or a bad person, living as a servant of God or not living as a servant of God, there's the setting of our life and our decisions, which is in many ways outside of our control, and then there's what do we do with it, which is inside of our control, which is, and B is the only thing that we're judged on, right? I think, I don't know, that's the way I understand it. I don't know if that's helpful or useful. Just want to make one more point. I'm sorry, yeah?
Teshuva plays no part here.
Sorry?
Teshuva, the act of teshuva, doing some type of...
No, tshuva always plays an enormous part, but there are certain kind of... Tshuva, by its nature, means that in some cosmic sense, we're putting Humpty back together again, right? In other words, that's the miracle of tshuva, is that it's not just I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, and to a certain extent, it's as if it didn't happen, but to a certain extent, it's not as if it didn't happen. So you can do tshuva, and you can be all evened up with Hashem, but the consequences aren't, someone, God forbid, drives drunk and this terrible tragedy comes and he devotes the rest of his life to giving speeches for MAD and doing everything, and everyone can look at him and say, you're a great guy, but it doesn't bring the person back. So some consequences are going to be unfixable. Like Mamzeret, perhaps. I don't know. That's just my point. The last point, and I feel bad just dropping this on you and running to teach. We can talk about it either by email, whatever you want. I think what we also see from here is that as opposed to natural world genetics, where what we pass on to the next generation is just about, as far as I know, set at our own conception, right? My genetic code is unchangeable, well, I mean, with the exception of really extraordinary nuclear whatever. But for the most part, my genetic code that I'm gonna pass on to my next generation is set before I'm even born. It seems, and not everybody thinks this is true, but I think this is compelling evidence. It seems that spiritual genetics, the genetic line of kochot that I pass on to my next generation is dynamic. And that every decision that I make is going to be part of that which I pass on to my children. And therefore, it's not that Amalek was inclined to attack, they attacked us. And therefore, that imposes this scar on their children. It's not that Avraham was born as this super ma'amin. It's that he chose to find Hashem. The fact that he demonstrated to Hashem that he's going to teach his children the ways of tzedek and mishpat, his actions are what gave us that boost that carried the decision of our ancestors to say Na'aseh v'nishma. Aaron's decision, whatever it is, this genetic legacy that we inherit from our parents and give over to our children seems to be constantly changing based on the decisions that we make, which is, on the one hand, lovely and comforting, and on the other hand, I find tremendously scary, that my kids who are walking around now in this cosmic way that we don't really understand are being influenced by what my davening looked like this morning, etc. So, is it true? I'm not 100% sure. I think so. You can choose to, I don't know. I hope you choose to think about it. And,
Is that the part your wife doesn't like?
that she really doesn't like. She thinks I have no evidence on that whatsoever. I think this is evidence. So,
I know the time is up, but how does this affect Balchuv, like NCSY actions and a Balchuv and all of that, the parents are so.
I don't know, to me, it makes the Baal Tshuva that much more heroic, right? In other words, they are taking the setting that was set for them where the odds really were set against them, and really no one could have faulted someone who grew up without a history of Torah and mitzvos. So your path, your challenges might be a little bit different, right? The Chazon Ish already paskin 100 years ago almost, that we treat people who aren't in the Torah world, that they have the status of a tinok shenishba, that they're not held accountable for. We don't say that every time you turn a light on Shabbos, if you never knew what Shabbos is, that each time you're racking up these pinball Avera points, and yet that person goes and, through their own initiative, goes and finds Torah and mitzvos. To me, that seems like, I think before we had this conversation, that was an act of tremendous heroism. I think afterwards, probably at least as much so. And then what you're doing is you're shifting what, both in terms of certainly nurture, but maybe also in terms of spiritual genetic nature, what the legacy that they pass on to their children. I don't know, to me that seems like a tremendous act of spiritual heroism, I think.
So there is a whole field that I don't totally understand and don't know if I buy into, epigenesis, that also speaks of experiences and how that impacts actually the DNA. And so that it's a kind of combination of nurture and nature.
So I think there is a radio lab that discusses this. If I'm not mistaken, is that something that they used to believe, that your genetic code can change, and then it was totally off the table, and there was some guy who like faked results?
So I don't know, I heard of it in a different context, you often hear of it in the context of Holocaust survivors. So, you know, it used to pass on second, third generation.
Interesting.
That they say is, or trauma victims, that is beyond just the environment, but that somehow that environment and experience has impacted, so that while your davening does not directly maybe change their genetic spiritual code, but that somehow their experience of being with a person who connects to God
Right.
impacts on who they
Right.
are and on what they have there. I don't
That's
get it,
really,
it is.
that's so interesting.
it,
I'll lean there to try and find the because that's what we do here. I'll try to find the podcast that I was talking about that I think might be talking exactly about what you're referring to, if I'm understanding both you and it correctly, and I'll try to send it around.
I don't understand it, but I'm just saying
I
that
will
that
ask, yeah,
gives
maybe we can both understand it better, okay? And